Hi, welcome to this webinar. My name is Susana Carneiro, and I'm currently the Executive Director of Centro PINUS. We are a Portuguese NGO focused mainly on maritime pine, Pinus pinaster. If we translated our name, it will be Pine Center. So 2 years ago, together with IUFRO, we started a webinar series entitled Pine Silviculture, International Success Factors. Today, after a first webinar that was about Scots pine in Central Europe, Monterey pine in Chile, and Pinus spatula in Africa, I am excited to share that we are expecting more than 100 participants from 11 different countries in 3 continents that are joining us to learn about pine plantations in South Brazil. So this webinar will take about 90 minutes to 2 hours. We have a flexible timing. We will definitely have a short break, and we will be inviting you to leave us comments and questions throughout the webinar in the Q&A icon. And we would like to inform you that the presentation that the speaker will be using will be later sent to you via email. So now I would like to start introducing today's speaker. It is Professor Peter Spathelf. He is a professor for applied silviculture at Eberswalde University for Sustainable Development in Germany. After having studied forestry sciences at Freiburg University, he entered the State Forest Service. He got his PhD at the Institute for Forest Growth at University of Freiburg, and now a relevant detail. For 3 years, he was a lecturer of the German Academic Exchange Service at the Brazilian Federal University of Santa Maria. That's where he got the special expertise that he's going to share with us. He is a dean of the Faculty of Forest and Environment at Eberswalde University, and moreover, he is in charge of climate change and forest adaptation with the German Forestry Association. Hi, Peter. I invite you to join us by turning on your camera. And I would like to start by thanking you for taking the time to share your expertise with us. And the floor is now yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Susana. Thank you. Obrigado. It's my pleasure again to join you and to give this presentation for IUFRO and Centro PINUS, and for all who are with us this afternoon. So it's my pleasure and my honor to share a little bit of what I'm doing at Eberswalde University. So I'm not only teaching temperate silviculture at Eberswalde University, but we are also involved in international study programs and are teaching tropical, subtropical silviculture, so plantation forestry, but also forest restoration, for example, so international aspects. So, and I want to emphasize that my presentation today is together with Professor Mauro Schumacher, or was developed together with Professor Mauro Schumacher. He's a professor for forest ecology and soil sciences at the Federal University of Santa Maria, and hopefully he is with us this afternoon. And he provided some interesting slides of a case study for the presentation, and we will see that in the second half this afternoon. So thank you once again for establishing this format of international webinar series on pine species. And if you agree, I will start.
Yes, let's start.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the title is Management of Fast-Growing Pine Plantations in South Brazil, together with Mauro Schumacher. And I will start with some general considerations about plantations and pine plantations. So plantations very often have the reputation to represent just poorly structured stands with low tree species diversity. Plantations just provide low quality wood products is very often the statement, yeah. And plantations, so many people saying that negatively affect regulating and supporting ecosystem services. Sometimes you can find really harsh comments on plantations. Yes. For example, a little bit longer ago, plantations are not forests. And of course, there's a
difference.
Quite a range in plantation forestry. There are very homogeneous plantations, and there are also more innovative, more diverse plantations. And we can diversify plantation forestry in the future and manage them in a more ecosystem-friendly way. That would be quite a hypothesis for the presentation this afternoon. So once again, for maybe some people who joined us, where is Eberswalde located? It's in the northeast of Germany, so in the federal state of Brandenburg, near the capital region of Germany. And here is my university. It's the University for Sustainable Development, Eberswalde. I will talk about the relevance and some definitions and systems of plantation forestry. Then we go to ecosystem services from pine plantations. And finally, we show you this case study, some considerations on nutrient supply and sustainability of South Brazilian pine plantations. And hopefully we can conclude something. So the relevance, the definitions, and the contributions of plantation forestry, ladies and gentlemen, is very important. So look at this quite old figure, but it's still relevant, I think, and it's valid. You can see that many countries which have a considerable plantation forest estate, they provide a significant part of their wood production from plantations. So Brazil, with more than 500 million hectares of forests, provides some 60 or even more % of the timber production from plantations on a relatively small area of 7 million hectares. And other countries, it's the same or even more pronounced, the situation. So plantations are important, and plantations will be even more important.
Yeah, definitely.
Maybe in the future.
We need plantations. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So we will have a huge demand in the future. Yeah. There are forecasts that many more products from plantations will be demanded in the near and in the far future. So it's a relevant sector, although it's a sector with a somewhat bad reputation, but it's important. And planted forests, the new term from FAO, is not plantation, it's planted forests. Planted forests are afforestations or reforestations with mostly only 1 or 2 species at the time of planting. They are even-aged and have a regular spacing. Plantations are very often fast-growing or are systems with fast-growing species and have high yields, so more than 15 cubic meters per hectare a year with very many species. So they are fast-growing and high-yielding systems. Plantations, and especially in Brazil, but also in other countries, but I know it a little bit from Brazil. Plantations started in the second half of the last century. So the majority of plantations and the most intensive activity on that. And plantations were very much supported by financial incentives of these states. Brazil, for example, wanted to establish a raw material base for its industry, a growing economy already since decades, and plantations were seen to be as an important instrument to do so. So with many specific financial instruments, so reduction of tax rates, but also with special credits, etc. I will not go into detail here. With many incentives, different incentives, you can see it on the figure. The plantation forestry estate was built up or was established since 1967 in Brazil. Mm-hmm. And there was also maybe a triggering event, which was the FAO World Symposium on Man-Made Forests in 1967, which gave a certain impetus to the development of plantations worldwide. Mm-hmm. And you find quite similar instruments for Indonesia and maybe also other countries. The two most important genus of plantation tree species were eucalypt and pine in Brazil. And you see eucalypt even more important. So the size of the eucalypt stands is even larger than the pines. And then at the end of the 20th century, so in the 1980s, 90s, the financial incentives more or less stopped or declined, and also the plantation activity curbed and went down a little bit, so that we have only a certain amount of newly planted forests from 1990 on. And in total, there are several million hectares of plantations in Brazil. They can be seen as so-called industrial plantations, but also more and more important are plantations for rural development. Maybe not so much with the genus pine, but other plantation species. They are used for environmental purposes, for example, to restore degraded areas or to protect the soil. So the genus Acacia, for example. And we can see there is a shift or a change from this production orientation towards other purposes of plantation forestry. 7% after a figure or a statistic given by FAO, 7% of the forest area in the world is plantation forestry, or these real planted forests, so around 300 million hectares. And a significant part of the plantations is also located in the tropics and in the subtropics. Regarding the systems of planted forests or plantations, you can find very often, still today, but when I was there, very often we could find homogeneous systems to produce industrial timber. You can see here a pine plantation in South Brazil. So you find exactly the criteria for these fast-growing, high-yielding plantations. You have one species, you have a regular spacing, and you have a homogeneous system with the goal to produce industrial timber. Yeah. But pine plantations are also interesting in a different way. This slide is from northern Argentina, in the state of Misiones. You can see a pine plantation as a so-called nurse crop for a more valuable timber species or tree species in the understory, which is Tona ciliata. It's a species in the mahogany group or timber group. So a very valuable tree species, which is protected by the nurse crop of a pine shelter.
And so both species are planted.
Yes, both species are planted. Yeah,
yeah.
It's a planted system.
Yes,
yeah?
Because here in Portugal, we have a similar kind of plantation, but then you have natural regeneration of broadleaves under the protection of the pine.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, that is another model, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if we go again to the genus Pine, we can say that from the more than 100 species, pine species, you find some of them in the southern hemisphere as plantation tree species. So the typical well-known plantation tree species, for example, in South America or in Africa or in Australia, are pine species. So Pinus 𝘱𝘱𝘯𝘶𝘃, so slash pine, or Pinus taeda loblolly pine, or Pinus radiata. So
Yes.
Pinus radiata is a very well-known example of a pine which was improved outside its natural range, because Pinus radiata is just from a small spot in California. But it's widely used in Chile and in other countries in intensive plantations. And why the genus Pine for plantation forestry, by the way? So pine has a wide range of species, the pine genus. So it's suited for a certain broad amplitude of sites, also including some poor and degraded sites. You can easily produce seedlings. You can improve genetically pine, and it has quite a good range of products you can provide with that species. It's a light demanding species with a pioneer character. So it can be planted on open areas, on cleared areas. So it has very good characteristics for being used as a widespread species in plantations.
Yes, that's why we are having this webinar series.
Yeah,
to get to know this better.
Yeah, exactly. And Kamesheit, a German forester, compiled some figures some years ago on southern hemisphere pine plantations, and you see with more than 4 million hectares, it's really significant. So so of course it's a conifer tree species, very relevant for mechanical characteristics of the wood is the tree ring width. So if you have very large tree rings, of course, with a lot of early wood, you have a downgrading of mechanical properties of the timber. Some pine tree species are more rich in resin, some others not. So it's an interesting tree species which can be, or timber species, which can be used for diverse purposes. Before we go to Brazil and South America, let me just emphasize the relevance of pine plantations in the US Southeast, where we have a significant estate with a long history. I won't go into detail, but especially with slash and loblolly pine, the species were already introduced since a longer time. The yield increased very much in these stands compared to the last century, for example. So it's a kind of model region with pine plantations. So the southeast of the United States, where some of the pines, by the way, are also native. Some of these very widespread used pines are native from there. And here you can see the area. Here is Florida and the southeast of the US with the well-known federal states there.
Yes, definitely one of the future webinars in this series will be about pines in the southeastern United States.
That would be highly welcome. And we have some real pine plantations also in Europe, just to mention them. So we have, for example, the radiata pine in Ireland, which is the left picture. And then we have
in Spain also.
In Spain, yes.
In
and in Spain, Here we have Aleppo pine and our colleague, our appreciated colleague, 𝘱𝘱𝘯𝘃𝘃, the silviculture professor from Valencia, on the slide. And then we have maritime pine, for example, in the southwest of France, where there is a huge pine landscape, I would say, in the province of Les Landes. So we have real pine plantations in Europe.
Yes.
And if we go now to productivity, you can see the productivity is significant. It's not so high compared to eucalypt, but it's a well-growing tree species in terms of volume production. It has a relatively short rotation cycle. So we will see it in Brazil. The rotation for pulpwood, for example, is 14 to 16 years, and the rotation for sawnwood in South Brazil, so Taeda and 𝘱𝘱𝘃𝘃, is 20 to 30 years, which is mentioned more or less on the right side of the table. And you have a very good productivity, yeah?
Yes,
so
excellent.
Yeah. Compared to the temperate zones, of course, the tropical zones perform a little bit better, where the growing conditions are better due to higher temperatures and higher precipitation. Yeah. And then we have a long tradition in some regions of genetic improvement. So the productivity of the species, of the pine species, were improved by selection, by hybridization, for example, by breeding, and then clonal propagation. So sometimes you find hybrids or clones of hybrids, and you have really very productive pine plantations. I cannot go into genetics because I'm not a geneticist and I don't know the methodologies. Yeah, we don't have the time. But genetic improvement is not only with eucalypt, where the productivities are very, very high, but it's also relevant with pine.
Yes, in Portugal too.
So
we also have genetic breeding for pine in Portugal.
Yeah, okay, fine. And the productivity, you can see, is of course higher in the tropics. So you need less land for producing, for example, 1 million tons of pulp of a species in the tropics in Brazil compared to Spain, Portugal, or to Scandinavia. So the industrial roundwood is really originating mostly from plantations. So 46%, maybe it's even higher today, and it will be higher in the future. So we have a very relevant sector also with good economic figures. So if you go to some economic criteria, decision criteria, you find the internal rate of return is quite high with plantation forests, with short rotation plantation forests, or the land expectation value is quite high. And normally, I would say the return in these systems is much higher than the return in native forest management systems. Of course, there are good opportunities also in native forest management systems with the production of valuable timber to generate a lot of money and to have a good return. But normally plantation forests, they provide 10, 15, 20% of return. Yeah,
that's amazing. If you compare the return from other investments, the investment of a plantation is really amazing.
Yeah, so that's why it's so attractive for investors or landowners. Yeah, here's some figures. And plantations, also pine plantations are also sometimes certified. So the plantation sector is not yet so relevant in certification. So here are some figures from FSC 2018. And the certification has not yet really arrived in the tropics. So in the tropics and in the subtropics, only 11% of the certified forests are lying in the tropics. So the instrument of certification, reasons to protect tropical forests, has not yet arrived in the tropics, so in many tropical forests. So there's still room for improvement. Okay, now let's go to another chapter. And let's talk about the provision of ecosystem services from plantations. So we take all the range of ecosystem services, not only the ecological side, but also the products. So we have the provisioning services. We have nice timber from pine plantations. So not only timber for construction, for maybe flooring or windows or so, but also engineered wood, for example, plywood or panels, or glued laminated timber. So we have a range of products of pine wood, which is interesting. We also have non-timber forest products. So resin, these are pictures which were given to me from a friend from Freiburg University, Leif Nutto, and resin production is one option, one possibility in pine stands. And it was even common in Germany, in the eastern part of Germany, until 1990, in the former German Democratic Republic. The production of resin was very common. So you saw many pines with these signs of resin collection, but it stopped in 1990.
Yes.
But
in Portugal, in Spain, we are actually we never completely lost resin tapping, but it declined. But now it's coming back, because it's like wood for construction. There is this huge demand in substituting products that are based on oil by products that are based on wood. So most resin comes from oil, and now they are trying to increase extraction using resin that comes from forests. So actually now we are in a very interesting period that we are trying to make new techniques for the resin tapping.
So these natural products have a competitive advantage against others. Yeah, that's a good development. Yeah.
And so that resin tapping, those pictures where was those pictures that you just showed us?
It was in Rio Grande do Sul.
Oh, in Brazil.
Northern part of Rio Grande do Sul. So in South Brazil.
Okay.
And if we look at the production strategies to produce timber from pine, we can distinguish between two directions. So the pulpwood strategy, where the intention is to produce a lot of medium-sized stems, so with a high volume, a high standing volume. And then you have on the other side the clearwood or valuable timber strategy, where you produce thick trees with larger grounds and a stem, bottom log free from knots. Yeah, that's the valuable timber approach. But in plantation forestry, mostly, maybe 90%, I don't really know, but 80–90% is still mass production. But I think valuable timber production, this is a different species, mahogany. But valuable timber production is a model which may more emerge in the future.
I believe so. Because of this trend of this growing demand for the products that have a natural and a renewable source?
So, for example, plantation forestry, not only in pure stands, but in mixed forests and with other production strategies. That can be a business model for landowners.
Yeah.
So there are, of course, traditional silvicultural tools to assess the growth, for example, yield tables. This is an example of a yield table for Pinus 𝘱𝘱𝘯𝘱𝘱, developed by a colleague from the Federal University of Santa Maria. So you can see it's the site index 22 at the reference age of 30, and the mean annual increment is 18.2 cubic meters per hectare.
It's amazing.
Yeah, that's good. It's not
it's not what we have in Europe. It's not what we have in Europe, right? Even in South Europe, it's much higher.
So it's okay. So this is a yield table, and there are, of course, other models I would say, to guide a stand or to develop a stand, but I didn't incorporate them because it's maybe too complicated and needs too much time. But there are also, of course, individual tree models to produce these valuable stems, which you can use. So let's go to other services. Let's go to the water question and water regulation. And you can see the best is to address this question is to look at the landscape level. The plantations are normally in South Brazil incorporated in a landscape with different uses. You have also natural forest. You have some reserves you must retain, as a landowner. And then you have the plantations, eucalypt mostly, but very relevant also pine. And then you have protected areas. So that's very important, riparian protection zones. So how we can address the water question on a landscape level, mostly with protected area management. On a stand level, of course, we can select more water efficient trees, a tree species of a certain genus. We can try to increase the soil carbon content, which enhances the water storage in the soil. We can conduct a good residue management to, for example, to reduce runoff and enhance infiltration. That we will see a little bit in the case study. So we can do something on stand level, but also on the landscape level, so to keep the water in the landscape matrix. Then site management is very important, and that will be discussed more in detail in the case study. And then we have the biodiversity question. So what about biodiversity of plantation forestry, of planted forest? I would say it depends. So there are homogeneous systems with a very low structural diversity. So you are not satisfied, of course, with the biodiversity question, but you can also take some countermeasures, again, on landscape level, to leave some natural vegetation, to leave some patches or some strips of natural vegetation. So to have a kind of land sparing approach. On the one hand, you have the intensive plantations, and on the other hand, you have protected areas to reduce the pressure on the different species there. So on stand level, of course, you can, for example, you can increase the rotation age and produce larger trees, so that in the understory, different other trees will establish. And I quite often saw in Brazil, under the pine or eucalypt plantations, when you have extended the rotation period, you saw many other tree species, broadleaf tree species, invading the area and enhancing the biodiversity there. So this is possible. So you have more or less the same measures as we have in continuous cover forestry, also in our type of forest management. No? Okay, now the carbon question again. What about carbon storage? Of course, we can store quite a significant amount of carbon in plantations. We can create new plantations and improve the carbon storage in the whole landscape. But we also can increase the standing volume or reduce the thinning intensity. So we have some approaches in climate smart forestry, that's maybe the new term, to increase the carbon storage in these systems. And there are some nice studies how much carbon can be stored, for example, in a loblolly pine plantation in South Brazil. Mauro Schumacher did such studies. And you can see the carbon storage is about 120-30 tons per hectare. That means if you calculate it into cubic meters, there are several hundred cubic meters necessary, of course, to provide this amount of carbon stored. Of course, these carbon storages, if we look at the Central European discussion, this pool of carbon is sometimes not very stable. So the more you accumulate carbon in forest stands, the more you increase the standing volume, the more vulnerable may a stand become, maybe, and the carbon
it's a trade-off.
Can be released. It's a trade-off, and for that we recommend in the continuous cover forestry, we recommend moderate standing volumes because we want to create regeneration on the whole area. But in plantation forestry, I would also say, yes, you can store maybe a little bit more carbon by increasing volume production.
Yes, it depends on the risk. When you consider countries where you have, for instance, fire risk, like in Southern Europe, you need to take into account the fire risk to have in order to have a safe stock.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Susana. Yes, that's great. If we want, we can make a break here, but it's not necessary.
I think
we can do it, or we can ask some questions from the chat.
Yes, I think we can have a break, and we can take this break to introduce some comments and questions. Sorry, because it's a bit difficult for me to read the comments and follow along with Peter at the same time. So fine. I invite you to leave comments. We take a 10-minute break and we'll come back. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, see you in 10 minutes. Hi, everyone. I hope that the break was useful. I took the time to read some comments that you kindly sent us. There were comments related to forest certification and how that can really improve pine plantations, namely with the silvicultural plantations, use plantations, with having endemic species and conservation areas within the plantations. And some of you were also kind to share with us a report, namely updating the numbers for FSC forest certification that gladly are now higher than what Peter had shared. We also have a question that I'll be addressing it to Peter, and then you will figure out during the presentation, if now or at the end or during your presentation, you will be addressing. And that is a question related to the character of pine as an invasive species in South Brazil. So you take the question when you think it's okay, Peter. So perhaps now we can follow to the case study that you were mentioning.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Susana. Thank you. I try to address this question of invasiveness, but it's maybe not so easy because I do not have detailed studies. We had a discussion on invasiveness on Douglas fir in Germany 6-7 years ago. There were allegations that Douglas fir is an invasive species, but it could be shown that on the most of the sites it is not. Yeah. So the question is also, how is invasiveness defined? Is it that the regeneration of the potentially invasive species is outcompeting the regeneration of the native tree species, and how it is controlled? Is it already invasive if it's the case per se, or if you cannot do anything against it in management, So there are some difficulties in definition and how to...
Yes, these questions are never easy to address. We also have this kind of discussions here in Portugal, not with pine, because pine is natural from this region, but we also have this discussion with eucalypt. But at the end, because these plantations have in the legal classification in Portugal addresses the economic relevance. So when a species has economic relevance, it is difficult for it to be considered an invasive species because there is a purpose for the species. But so maybe we will need a different webinar to discuss these issues because they are complex. Complex.
Okay, thank you. So now the case study, silviculture and ecology of pine plantations from South Brazil. So this was developed by Mauro Schumacher. So the slides you can see now are aspects from different studies and the work of Mauro Schumacher during the last 15 years. So he is head of the laboratory of forest ecology of the Federal University of Santa Maria. Yes, he is dealing with a lot with plantations, but from the soil side or from the productivity side. Once again, now the plantations in Brazil. So you can see we have mainly the two genus again, eucalypts and pine. Then you have others also, a small amount of other plantation tree species. That's mainly acacia. In Brazil, it's also teak, but small, I think. For example, teak was introduced, in my opinion, it was in 1973 in the federal state of Mato Grosso for high-value timber production. But mainly you have eucalypt and pine plantations. Acacia has a certain tradition also in South Brazil, in the federal state of Rio Grande do Sul. It is managed in silvipastoral systems in South Brazil with small-scale farmers. And they also use the bark, or they used at the time when I was there, they used the bark for tanning production. So again, byproduct, a non-timber forest product, which is quite valuable. So that's the plantation side in Brazil. And now the pine plantations in the federal states. And what you can see here, the concentration of pine plantation forestry is in the south of Brazil. So it's Rio Grande do Sul, Santa Catarina, and Paraná, and a little bit in Sao Paulo and Minas Gerais, which is in the center east.
Yeah.
So it's an activity in South Brazil. So the several few million hectares of pine plantations, and you see a slight increase is there, but the majority of the plantation forestry estate was established during this period of financial incentives in the last century, in the last half of the 20th century. All right, good productivity can be mentioned. So the average productivity of pine stands is more than 30 cubic meters per hectare a year, which is, I would say, 3 times as high as pine plantations in Germany, or even more.
Yeah.
So a good productivity, and this has something to do with also with selection and genetic improvement.
Yes,
So,
but mostly with the sites. Some
mostly
less,
with the sites, yeah.
Less land.
Exactly. So Scots pine, the ones who were in my webinar 2 years ago, remember in Germany, Scots pine, for example, is concentrated more and more on the poor and the nutrient poor and dry sites of the
where
site
you
spectrum.
have no other option.
Yeah,
as
exactly.
A forester.
So the study sites for the studies of Mauro Schumacher are located in South Brazil, mostly in Santa Catarina and Paraná. And you can see the natural conditions are quite good. You have temperatures of 15 to 20 degrees centigrade. You have a high annual rainfall. But we also have to say that we have some higher altitudes here also. So we have some low temperatures in June, July, August here, for example, in the mountainous range of Santa Catarina and Paraná. You can also have frosts and low temperatures. So it's a subtropical region. South Brazil is a subtropical region, but here we have the loblolly pine in the south and more in the center east of Brazil in the federal states of Sao Paulo, Minas Gerais, Rio de Janeiro. It's more Pinus caribeae var hondurensis. So as we mentioned, and now maybe comes the invasiveness question. Pinus taeda, which is natural from the southeast of the United States, is such a species which is described in the literature as an intolerant, aggressive pioneer species, which rapidly invades disturbed sites with maybe exposed soils. But that is maybe a special aspect of invasiveness. For me, invasiveness in the context of normal forestry is if regeneration from other tree species in an existing forest are outcompeted by an aggressive species. But what is described with Pinus taeda is that it's a rapidly colonizing, light-demanding species. Okay, and then we have Pinus caribeae, also light-demanding, also growing on shallow and dry soils, but it's maybe better suited for lower altitudes and warmer areas. So that's the situation in the study region. Now the pine plantation, some photos Mauro Schumacher took in the past. You can see on the left side a clone of pine, of loblolly pine, with 45 cubic meters of growth. So with a volume growth of 45 cubic meters, so you have large tree rings. The rotation cycle, as I mentioned, for pulp production is 14 to 16 and 20 to 30 sawnwood rotation cycle.
You can tell the rings are quite large.
Yes. So there's a lot of early wood and the mechanical properties are not so good.
Not so good.
So the planting density is, when I remember well, is maybe 3 to 2 meters or something like that. So only a few thousand trees per hectare. Okay, let's go to some interesting studies. So what the laboratory of forest ecology in Santa Maria is doing is also measuring the whole ecological factors. So they are measuring the bulk deposition, so the precipitation, and they try to analyze the fluxes of emissions and water. So the precipitation throughfall in a stand or in the stands is measured. Then, of course, the stem flow is also measured. And then you can finally make the balance. You can see one study shows that from a precipitation of 2,000 millimeters, which is set to 100%, the interception was 34%, the throughfall 61%, and the stem flow 5%. So these figures, of course, these are case studies. We see that there is quite a significant throughfall. We know, by the way, from Scots pine in Brandenburg in northeastern Germany, in the average development stages, so at ages of 30, 40, 50 years, the throughfall in Brandenburg in pure pine stands was or is very low. So there's a very high evaporation, yeah? And interception, so that there is nearly no infiltration into the soil in these stages of stand development. We have a lot of trees, a high standing volume, and from a hydrological standpoint, these stands are very unfavorable. Yeah. It seems to be a little bit better here, so the throughfall is higher in this case study, and of course the stem flow with the species with a rough bark is, in Germany, has stem flow rates of 15–20%. Yeah? So quite a significant stem flow. So this is the hydrological situation. Now let's go to some aspects of management of the pine. You can see the biomass, the remaining needles and maybe also fine branches very often is used by the industry for energy production. So this has consequences we will see for the site fertility, but it's of course a solution to use all parts of the stands. So the industry itself is coming and using the compartments which are not utilized for stem wood, for example. The question, of course, is which harvest system is maybe the most appropriate, and which harvest system provides the best sustainability. And you have two major systems which were compared in these studies: the so-called whole tree harvest system, where the tree is cut and together with the branches and the needles is taken out or removed from the forest and then processed and transported finally from outside the stand to the industry. And on the other side, you have a stem wood harvest system where you cut the tree and you make the assortments within the stand so that a significant part of the biomass, so fine branches, needles at least, are left in the stand. And this has consequences for the nutrient recycling or nutrient cycling and for sustainability. So the question is very relevant. Is plantation forestry in several rotations, is it sustainable at the end of the day? So the literature is quite full of that. So you find case studies where it could be shown that plantation forestry approaches are sustainable over several rotations. There are case studies from South Africa showing that. But on the other hand, depending from the harvest system, it can also be that such a system is degrading on a long term the site fertility. Yeah?
Yes, I believe it depends on the forest management and on the harvest system.
Exactly.
It depends.
Yeah.
It depends.
Yeah. It depends, and we will see the results of a study here in this table. You can see that, of course, the biggest nutrient loss occurs when plantations are harvested. So you remove the wood, you leave maybe the harvest rests in the stands or not, or eventually you make fires and you eliminate the biomass by burning. So that is the situation. And you can see here 3 harvest intensities in this table and the nutrients, the removal in kilogram per hectare and the average annual removal. You have a total removal of all the biomass compartments, so a whole tree harvesting system. And then you have the preferred, according to Mauro Schumacher, the preferred system by the industry at the moment and in the recent past, which was stem wood removal with bark, not whole tree, but with bark, because the bark was also used for energy generation, yeah? Or is used in the industry for energy generation. And then you have a stem wood model where only the stem wood is removed from the stand. And in these analyses, you can show where most of the nutrients are concentrated in which biomass compartments. There are nice studies. There are studies on pine. There are studies on acacia species, and you can show that a significant part of the nutrients are, especially P and K, are concentrated in the bark and in the fine branches and in the needles. So if you leave at least the branches, or if you would also leave the bark in the stand, you would be on the safer side, and you would be able to, on a longer term, to provide the basis for a sustainable system in terms of nutrient maintenance. Yeah,
because you make some money if you make a wall tree system, but then you need to spend money on fertilizer. So where is the balance?
Yeah.
Maybe there is no balance.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that is this study showing that. And if we go maybe just briefly to some of the elements, the nutrients, nitrogen is a very common element. So the emissions you can see the fluxes of nitrogen is quite significant. You have per year 8.4 kilogram per hectare as incoming into the system. And if you calculate now the emissions in a whole rotation period, you come to values more than 120 kilograms per hectare. So there is enough nitrogen, and it's no necessity to fertilize with nitrogen. Yeah? Different is the situation with phosphorus. So you see there is a low emission of phosphorus, and normally there would be a necessity on the medium and long term to fertilize with phosphorus to provide a sustainable nutrient cycling here. But the industry, according to the people there, the industry is hesitating yet to do this. So the question, of course, of fertilization is relevant. I'm not a real expert in fertilization, of course, so I can just comment on these studies. Here we have a study showing some effects of fertilization. You see some variance, some treatment variance on the horizontal axis. You have the control here, C, and then you have a reduction of throughfall. So it's an experiment where emission is reduced, B, and then you have a fertilizer variant. And you can see that with fertilization, we can enhance the production capacity. So this is basal area in square meters per hectare. And in this study, basal area could be increased by 23%. So fertilization is a huge topic. If you look at the plantation forestry literature, there are nice book chapters on fertilization. So relatively decisive is fertilization maybe until canopy closure. So this early fertilization is important for canopy expansion, for root development. So fertilizing it should be at the right time and with the right amount, of course, and the elements which are really necessary, which have been proven to be in a shortage. Yeah.
Yes.
So maybe
we have the experience in Portugal, for instance, that in most situations it is worth fertilizing with phosphorus, but not with other nutrients. Yeah. Yet many people fertilize with other nutrients. So it's really about having the right knowledge, like you mentioned.
So it's quite a special field, and maybe you have to make samples and analyze the soil before to decide on a fertilization. You should do this. So this is a study from this organization here in South Brazil. And then again, the situation of sustainability and how a whole rotation of pine management changes the soil characteristics. You can see here in this figure the different columns before and after the rotation has been achieved. So the organic matter here, so you have a reduction of organic matter, you have a slight interference into the pH value, but yet you have a significant reduction on several elements, on several important nutrients. We all know for which processes in plant physiology K and Ca, etc., magnesium is useful and is used. So I think in the core of these studies on nutrient availability and nutrient use is the question, do plantations exhaust the soil? So are plantations sustainable over longer rotations, over successive rotations? So I think very decisive in my opinion, and what I read, is the tree species question. So some species are maybe better than others. I read studies that, for example, no problem with melina in some studies in Africa. And then the rotation is important. So in longer rotations, we have less problems. And then, of course, as you mentioned, Susana, the management system. So
Yes.
the harvest system, we should avoid the whole tree harvesting, and we should not treat the debris, so
yes.
not burning the
believe,
debris.
Yes, I believe the intensity of the management and the preoccupation with sustainability is at heart. So you can have definitely plantations without exhaust in the soil, but you need to take that into consideration in your management.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly the point. So let's close the presentation with some nice slides on the use of pine in restoration activities. So forest restoration is very high on the political agenda since years already. You know, the Bonn Challenge and the New York Declaration, so that millions of hectares of forest should be planted.
Yeah.
And there are pledges of several countries. They want to plant so many thousands of hectares. But it's difficult if the conditions are difficult, such as here in the very south of Rio Grande do Sul. There is a desertificated area which was degraded by cattle ranging very much and soybean cultivation. So the processes are, of course, with time, soil erosion by heavy raindrops and wind, so that at the end, over decades, quite a semi-desert developed. So with more or less sand and no vegetation cover. And here, a nice study and activities, reforestation activities by our South Brazilian colleagues were conducted. So it was Pinus taeda, loblolly pine, which was planted. And you can imagine the difficulties of restoration in such an environment. You can see in the background, by the way, the rangeland conditions. You have some forests on the top of the hills, but you have some grasslands more or less degraded. And here you can see the rows of the loblolly pines. The temperatures are very high. At the end and the plant development, it's not so easy. But I do not have at the moment, or maybe we do not have mortality figures. Maybe we can show this in another event. So this is the planting. The trees are fertilized. Yeah. So fertilization is a question here. This is the situation of the plantation after 10 months. You see the spacing, yeah? So maybe 3 meters or 4 meters and
even
4 to 2 meters.
Yes, even in such harsh conditions, the plantation looks great.
Yeah, it looks quite good, and it shows the robustness of these species.
Yes.
No? Yes. So they have some potential also for restoration, which is very good. Here the liming. There is a liming activity of 2 tons per hectare. So I think to improve the soil conditions, to improve the pH values of the soil, and to make better available the nutrients, the less nutrients we have in the soil. So liming. And here the Pinus taeda plantation after 29 months, and you see within the rows there's already canopy closure. So the crowns are touching each other, and in a few years, maybe in 5 years from that time on, there is canopy closure and a new environment in a stand, within the stand, is created.
Yes.
So I think this is a decisive stage, the first years, to have a successful or
Yes.
not
And the
plantation
survival,
restoration.
yes, the survival rate looks really high.
Yeah.
And for a European, that is an amazing plantation. We don't have plantations like this in Europe with 29 months. So
yes,
it's,
of course, that's the
yeah.
growth potential is still there under
Yes.
these difficult conditions.
Even though the soil was so degraded,
Yeah.
the potential is still very good.
Yeah. So that's the area from above. So you have these two experimental areas in this degraded land. You see it from above now. And with this case study and with the final part, so with the restoration part, which is becoming more and more important, you remember the distinction between the productive plantations and the protective plantations at the beginning, which I made.
Yes.
And this is a protective plantation primarily, yeah. And we know from the plantation activities, for example, in China, in North China, to protect against desertification, to exactly avoid this. So this is more and more important. So I would first draw a little bit conclusion on the nutrient and productivity question. So the nutrient loss and the sustainable management or the unsustainable management can be avoided by managing the internal nutrient cycle. So actively doing something, doing residue management or mulching, no burning of residues is one approach. And then leaving compartments of the biomass on the site, so no whole tree harvesting. Yeah. And also the whole question of cautious harvest operations. We did not show the whole question of access and how the machines are used. We know from our forestry and also from certification requirements that we must be very careful in Central Europe with the soil. So we reduce access for machines maybe on 10 to 15% of the productive area, which then is finally compacted very often. Yeah. And lost for, I would say, for the ecosystem somewhat, because ecosystem processes are very much reduced on these compacted lines. But it's a decision on the rest of the area. We will not use machines, but on the lines, yes. So cautious operations, so reduced impact logging operations are also part of a good management system. And for the whole pine plantation forestry topic, I would conclude some quite general conclusions that I think, although I like to teach continuous cover forestry in Eberswalde, I love it to teach this kind of forestry, of near natural forestry, but I acknowledge the relevance of plantation forestry. Yeah. We didn't talk yet about plantation forestry for reducing the pressure on native forests. There are also studies showing that they fill a gap in the provision of timber, and they sometimes really can reduce the pressure on native forests. We didn't discuss that yet. So plantations are relevant, and they provide the raw material for growing economies. So different categories of products, also non-timber forest products, not only timber. Yeah. And plantations are valuable contributions to the socioeconomics of an area. So they may provide labor. They provide regulating and supporting ecosystem services. In plantations, carbon is stored, and hopefully stored for a longer period. either in the plantation, which is managed over several rotations, and in the products, yeah. Although many of the products are still short-lived products, not products with a longer duration. But so plantations can be also have positive effects in that respect. And plantations are definitely a means to restore degraded areas. So they become more and more important. So tree planting or planted forests are important here. Otherwise, we cannot achieve the goals of restoration, which are postulated. Yeah. So I think it's a relevant and still in importance increasing sector. And in many countries, we have a segregation approach for that. So we have the plantation forest estate and the high intensive production. And on the other hand, we have, of course, the attempt to conserve biodiversity and forested landscapes in conservation categories and leave them more or less untouched. So I would like to thank you very much for your patience and for attending this webinar. So you can contact me and maybe also Mauro Schumacher. He is in Brazil at the moment, in Santa Maria. And we both thank you for your patience and for attending this webinar, and say goodbye. But maybe there are still some questions to be discussed at the end. But yes. First, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Peter and Mauro. I would like to add that it's a big planet, and we have space for all kinds of forests. And we not only we have space, but we need it. So we see this confrontation in Portugal, production versus conservation versus restoring. But the fact is that sometimes there is no separation, because the plantation that you just showed for the restoration, the wood was there and the biodiversity can be there. So it's not about separating, it is about integrating, I think.
That's maybe our Central European perspective, which I also support. Yeah.
Yes. So I am quite positive that we all learned about plantations in South Brazil, but I'm positive that there is a lot to learn. So perhaps in this long journey that we are taking around the world, I am sure that it justifies to come back to Brazil. It's a big country, so in 90 minutes, I'm sure we didn't cover everything.
No, not at all.
So I want to thank all of you for joining us. I want to thank the colleagues that added some comments in the section. We are going to take a look and share the information.
Okay.
Like we said in the beginning, Peter's presentation will be shortly sent to you via email, and also the recording. So if you couldn't follow all the webinar, you can still look at the recording. So again, thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you again in the next webinar series. So if you don't follow IUFRO and Centro PINUS in social media, please do so, because we always advertise the webinars in this series. At the moment, we don't know when is going to be the next webinar, but we'll let you know when that happens. So see you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Susana, for moderating.
Thank you,
Obrigado.
Peter.
Muito obrigado.
Obrigada.